I think of all of the lessons of our study of how we got the English Bible, this one has been my favorite to prepare for, at least so far. And I hope that as we discuss this material this morning, perhaps the history of this section of the development of our English Bible will have a great impact on you, because it has on me, both in studying it in the past and refreshing my memory on some of these things for this class. We today are going to endeavor, as we move along this timeline, to discuss a man known as the father of the English Bible. His name was William Tyndale. Now, you will hear several different pronunciations of that name. It either comes down to Tyndall or Tyndale. Most English scholars that I know of pronounce it Tyndale, so that's the way I do. If you are holding a copy of the King James Bible this morning, though he was born 200 years, nearly, give or take a year or two, before its first publication, the majority of that text is thanks to the work of this man. If you are holding a New King James translation, the same is the case. William Tyndale is called the father of the English Bible because he was the first to complete a full copy of the English Scriptures. Prior to this, I know we've discussed a few early copies, that is mainly the Wycliffe translation, but here are some unique things about it that make it very different from Tyndale's. Wycliffe's translation was directly translated from the Latin Vulgate. We've discussed in great detail how at this period of history, during this portion of the Middle Ages in Europe, the Catholic Church had presented an edict which made it illegal for the Scriptures to be produced in any language other than Latin. And so, the endeavor of Wycliffe, as we studied a few weeks ago, was to provide the English Bible to the common people. Put the Word in the hands of the common people. That's the byword of this whole study, and really, it comes to its full fruition in Tyndale. At least to preparing the way for our modern versions now. What Wycliffe was endeavoring to do, he could only do by handwriting. So the number of copies is extremely limited. His source material was extremely limited because he only had access to the Latin Vulgate rather than, as Tyndale would, the original text, both in Greek and Hebrew. We'll talk a little bit more about his educational background in just a little bit. But he was only able to translate the New Testament, Wycliffe was. So not only were the copies limited, so they didn't spread very far. Most of them spread amongst academia. This is how one, like we talked about last week, John Huss, was able to come across Wycliffe's writings and his translation, and therefore it informed his efforts towards this same goal. But up until this point, in the life of William Tyndale, there has yet to be a completed version of the Scriptures, Old and New Testament, in the English language. Tyndale would do that in great distress. I think that's another thing that strikes me. Here again we have another example of a man who was not a Christian, as we know full well, but truly was dedicated to his Lord inasmuch as he understood. Inasmuch as he was burned at the stake in a tremendously painful way in order to again accomplish this goal. Allow all men to have access to the Scriptures and thereby judge what the Word says. Learn for themselves what God would have the common people to know. One of his major arguments against the keeping of the Scriptures out of the hands of the common people that he would have with several Catholic priests, as he was a private tutor for a wealthy family in England before his eventual exile. One of his main arguments against them in discussing this idea, whether or not this ought to be possible, whether or not this ought to be legalized, was this: whom did Jesus teach? Did Jesus go directly to academics? Did Jesus go directly to the religious leaders of the day? The majority of Jesus' disciples, while he was on this earth, were whom? Common people. Who flocked to him in droves? Common people. Those that the religious leaders of the day looked upon and said, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners, the riffraff of society? Do you remember what Jesus said to them? It's not come for those who need not a physician. The well, they have no need for a doctor. He has come for those in need of treatment. Come that they might have life and have it abundantly. So Tyndale's argument was that if Jesus, the very Son of God, the Word himself, came in flesh and came to the common people for a common purpose, to open the way into the kingdom of God for them, why should we, he being part of that religious academia, that religious hierarchy in the day, why should they do anything to prevent the people from learning the truth? I admire Tyndale quite a bit for his tenacity and also for his brilliance. He was born in 1409 in England to landowners. So unlike Huss, unlike Wycliffe, who we previously studied, he does not come from a commoner's background. His family were well-to-do. And that provided something for him which would suit him for the rest of his life, as miserable as it may be. You see, because he will grow into a man who is exiled from his home nation. He will never return. He is captured and he dies far from his home. He never marries, and he spends 12 dedicated years, day in and day out, working to provide a Bible in English. We can credit this man to a great degree for what we hold in our hands. Because even today, though the King James Version has gone through one revision, major revision, since its original translation in 1611, most of us can credit him with 93% of the text which we hold within the covers of our Bibles. However, before we get into any more detail on the educational background which was provided for Tyndale, because of his background as one who came from, if not nobility, at least wealth and some substance, to the point where they were able to provide for him the best education in the world in those days, we need to talk about another man who came along, relatively was a contemporary of Tyndale in some ways, but had he not come along earlier, we would not see the result of the great work of this man. And that is one Dutch philosopher known as Erasmus. Of all the things we have to thank Erasmus for, this which I hold in my hand is the greatest blessing You say, what is this? This is a Greek New Testament. This is not any Greek New Testament. This is what is known as the majorative text, that is also known as the received text, or in Latin, the Textus Receptus. It is also known as the Erasmus text. This text is taken on his name. Why? Because he was the one who was able to take the compilation of those Greek manuscripts which were available to him in St. Basil's, where he was a priest of the Catholic Church in Holland, and was able to put this compilation of the scriptures together. In 1516, this book was published. It is from this Greek text where the King James is translated. It is from this Greek text that a good portion of some other translations are translated. Again, the earliest manuscripts that we have were not yet found at this point. Vaticanus and Sinaiticus were not yet in much favor because they had not been found yet. So this was the majorative text. They took all of the manuscripts that we have available to us, thousands of them that we have, copies upon copies of the original documents, as we discussed in some of our early lessons, and through a great deal of effort, Erasmus put together this text, which has been the foundation of translation into the English language for hundreds of years. If anyone would be interested in taking a look at this, I will leave it up here today, and you can take a look at that. In 1516, he publishes the Textus Receptus. Tyndale is able to get his hands upon a copy, and he begins to translate directly from the Greek his New Testament. Later, he will be able to get a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures and translate directly from the Hebrew to the English language for his Old Testament. We owe a great deal of Tyndale's success to Erasmus. And you say, well, why did Erasmus do this? What spurred him to this point? It all goes back to this knowledge being put behind locks and closed doors. Even among academia, to a degree, the full revelation of the Scriptures was held back from them because most of them didn't study these texts. You could, and you were considered a scholar of languages if you did. But most of them just studied and interpreted and made their lessons either by the direct teaching of the Pope, that which is spoken in ex cathedra, as is called in the Catholic Church, or what scriptures they did study came from the Latin Vulgate, which by the time of Erasmus had become so corrupted that it infuriated Erasmus. And that's what began this process. Now, sometimes you and I, we may pick up a book known as an interlinear. You may see that in a Bible bookstore somewhere. You may have heard me and Doug talk about them in our classes before at different times. What an interlinear is for us today, and you can buy them at any Bible bookstore or order them online, is usually an English translation with the Greek words above it. It is not smoothed out as a translation usually is to make sense in English. It is just corresponding English words to each Greek part of speech in 2 lines. And basically, what this is the result of the very first interlinear. Because what Erasmus does, because so much fury has built up within him at the corruption of the Latin text, is that he takes the Latin text and the Greek text and goes back and makes an interlinear revision of the Vulgate. Now, later on, that Greek text is taken out and produced in a form similar to this. Not quite as practical as this. You look at some of the original copies of the Erasmus text, and they're going to look like one object that I will show you next week as we get into the study of the King James Bible. They will look similar to my reproduction of a 1611 King James. Very ornate and put together with a lot of artistic flavor. Because again, books, though they were easier to produce because of the Gutenberg press, which we discussed last week, were still very expensive. They were precious items, but yet copies of books were becoming more and more available to people. Had it not been for Erasmus and his work in producing this completed New Testament text, we may not have our King James versions. We may not have our modern versions as we have because of the efforts of Tyndale, which are a direct response to the work of Erasmus. Now, that all sounds very heavy, doesn't it? Sounds like it takes a great deal of education in order to understand. To a degree, at least in this point of translating the scriptures, it does take some education. And Tyndale had that in droves. As in the age of 12, he is sent to Oxford to study. And he becomes a eminent scholar of languages. He is fluent in 8 languages, both written and spoken. This man is a genius. But do not think that because he is sent to Oxford at 12 years old, that he is a genius in outright. The school worked in a different sense than it does now, though Oxford is still in existence, of course, and still well regarded as one of the best educations that anyone can receive in the world. When they would send their children through this university program at such young ages, they were sending them in a preparatory system. He would spend the next 10 years being educated there, graduating from Oxford when he is 22. He spends 10 years studying the languages, but yet has no real connection with spirituality. Yes, he has entered the priesthood, so to speak, but he really has no deep connections or thoughts towards theology. He is more driven at this point in time by the pursuit of excellence and the pursuit of education. That will all change when he comes in contact with some who were influenced by the writings of Wycliffe and by some of the challenges which Wycliffe and the other reformers, and also the early writings of Martin Luther in Germany, as they were being influenced by these ideas that said we need to change. We see problems with what is going on. As he began to be influenced by these people, he had sort of a revelation, so to speak. Not a supernatural one in any way, shape, or form, but as he began to study the texts for himself and piece these things together before he ever thought about translating them into English, he began to see the differences. He began to see the inconsistencies. And it is this Lord, the one presented in these texts, that he begins to follow in his mind. Again, though, with that same Reformation ideology. That's the only problem. He does not go back far enough. And it is so sad. But yet, we have so much to thank for this man and his efforts in producing this translation. And so he has to find a way to do so in secret. Upon graduating from Oxford at 22, again fluent at this time in 5 languages, he thinks, I don't have enough education. He's already achieved a master's degree, and he wants to continue on further. So what does he do? He goes to yet another seminal bastion of education in the English countryside. He moves from Oxford to Cambridge. Now, many of you may have a copy of the Cambridge Scriptures. Still today, the Cambridge Publishing House out of Cambridge University, it makes some of the finest copies of the English Scriptures that are made today. And this is the background, the educational background from which Tyndale comes. He masters 3 more languages while he's there, receiving his doctorate. And he begins to translate at night in secret. He continues this upon his graduation from Cambridge, where he begins to serve as a priest in small parishes along the English countryside, until an English noble named Sir John begins to hire Tyndale as his private tutor for his children. And as he is living there in that home, at night he is feverishly working his way through the Greek New Testament, translating it in the English with the same byword that he is holding on to. Give the common people the Word of God. No longer does he believe that interpretation ought to be left up to the minds of the Catholic Church. No, he believes that interpretation ought to be left up to the minds of the people as they study and become more familiar with the text themselves, weighing it against what the church says. Does this match up with the text? This is an idea that is very common to us, but to them, this was otherworldly. To ever question such things was thought of as heresy and blasphemy and dangerous. You see, because by this point in time, we are looking at a period around 1522 at this moment. By this period in time, an edict has already been passed, which says we burn heretics. Anyone which the church declares as a heretic for any reason is subject to death by burning at the stake. Anyone, no matter their position in life, no matter their societal status, if they are found to be a heretic, claimed to be a heretic, convicted of such, they will die. From this moment forward, Tyndale and anyone else who follows after him or believes in the same things that he does, if they speak out loud, will surely die. Yes, Doug?
That's a very Christian attitude, isn't it? You don't agree with us, we burn you.
Exactly, isn't it? Odd that it comes from a place based out of Rome, isn't it? That was a thought that came to me. Yes, sir.
What made him a heretic other than translating from one language to the other the Bible?
That was exactly it. The church had declared that it was wrong to do anything of that sort outside of the Latin language. So if they declared it, they rule when you're right or you're wrong.
They wanted to keep people from knowing the Bible.
Yes.
I think we've got it bad today. Really.
And do you see why I made this such a point in our early lessons, to show the hypocrisy of the modern campaign which this same group of people is running now, saying that we gave the world the Bible. No, they did everything that they could by historical fact to keep the Bible out of the hands of the people.
Well, who controlled all this stuff? The Catholic Church?
Yes. They ruled the world at this point. Their power was unmatched at this moment, even more so than the monarchies of Europe. They had reached that point. Yes, Doug?
There's instances in history of the Pope riding on a horse being led by kings
Yes.
through the town. And also the Pope putting his foot on the neck of certain kings.
Literally. Yes. This was something that we have not seen in our world, but this is the world in which they live. Yes, Miss Nancy?
When did the Catholic Church finally allow people to read the Bible?
This, even today, though they have their own translation, which you can also buy in English today, even today it's discouraged to a degree, though they allow it. The exact date is not coming to mind right now, but I will find that out for you and make sure to get that to you.
Well, when I was a kid, I was with a lot of Catholics in the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
But I've got one diehard Catholic friend who proudly told me the other day that the Bible had never been read by him.
Yeah. It's still discouraged. I remember, and I'll get to you in just a second, I remember when I was, probably a little bit younger than Will, maybe not as old as Caroline. One of the first people I tried to study with was a friend of mine. And he was raised in that background. And I had been somewhat raised in that background before my father was restored. You all know that my mother came from that. And so I still have a lot of family in that movement and sort of thing. And so I studied with him. And he began to see a lot of the things that I was saying because it was the first time he had really read any of this. I can remember sitting across a lunch table with him discussing this one day. And, he turned to me and he said, "You realize I've only ever read the book of Matthew." And I thought, wait a minute. Of course, in my young mind, I had to compute that because it was so different for me. But it's still discouraged to a great degree today, though there are some who do. It's still not commonplace. Again, the church directs what you think anyway. Regardless of what the Bible says, it still holds that kind of power over them. Now, worldwide, not so much. There's a lot that led up to that, and we don't have time in this short of a segment in class in 13 weeks to go into all of that. But even when my mother was a child, it was even more discouraged than it is today. It's almost to a point now, technology-wise, and perhaps with the way people look at the world, that they almost can't publicly discourage it to the great degree that they did. But even in the 60s, when my mother was a little girl, it was greatly discouraged. And she would talk about that, even with me as I was growing up. So they've allowed it for quite a while. The exact date, I cannot tell you at this moment, but I will look that up. But Doug, you had a comment to make.
Yeah, and I don't have much to add other than what you just said, but I had a coworker at work that confirmed that when he was a kid in the 60s that they discouraged them from reading because the priest said that he would teach them what they needed to know. And if they read it on their own, they might be likely to, get strange ideas and be led astray. Which, I guess it all depends on, do you trust somebody else to teach you what you need to know, or do you need to read it for yourself?
And in that time, they did. Now, just to get into a little bit of modern history for a second, we've got just a little time where I can. There is a big movement right now to do away with the Latin Mass. And that is a huge development going on right now. And part of the reason, again, is the desire of the people trying to expand somewhat, at least among intelligentsia, as some of them are becoming more comfortable with Protestants, which is something that I don't think I would have ever been able to say. At least I haven't my whole life thought I would be able to say. There is a movement among the higher-ups within the church now to do away with the Latin Mass and only go to an English Mass, which is a huge deal. But there's also a lot more opposition. You won't see it publicly because, again, there is an element of fear there. But if you talk to the common folks, and maybe you've experienced this with your coworker at times, and Doug, I don't know. I know I've experienced this with some of my more traditional family. With the current pope that they have, some of his statements have been so off the wall that even they have begun to question some things in private conversation. They would never do it in public, obviously, for fear of retribution.
I thought he was infallible.
Well, by their determination, yes.
How
But
can they question what he says then?
and that's why they don't do it publicly. Do
Well,
you
they
see?
also have a public relations situation now.
Yes, they do. That has been growing for decades now, and has certainly come to a head within the last few decades. That's a great point to make, Miss Sue. I'm glad you brought that up. With all of the corruption that goes on in such things, and we won't talk about the details of such things, we're all aware of that. But with all of that going on, the world sees through it like cheesecloth. And when the world sees through it, you really have a problem. Now here is another problem to that. To a segment of the world, and perhaps a large segment, that is their view of Christianity in totality. So when they see that, and they see through the holes, they reject the whole idea to start with. That's where we really face a battle there, is preconceived notions, just like we face with the Protestants as well. You know, it's the same kind of thing. When human logic is involved, sometimes people will throw a baby out with the bathwater. And so that's a challenge that we face evangelistically as well. But at this point in time, they had a far-reaching power. And really, since the official split in 1050, they had an overreach of power beyond what we can imagine. So when you think of the Catholic Church, don't really think of a religious body, though they were. Think of a theocracy. Think of a kingdom which rules the world. And their drive is to say we are ruled by God, but yet we are interpreted by the church. You see, that was their argument. And as Tyndale would be invited to these dinners, sometimes when these bishops and these cardinals would come and visit Sir John, he would be invited to these dinners, and he would get into these heated arguments with these priests over this subject. Should the people have the right to see for themselves? And that would always be their argument, that the truth is to be presented through the interpretation of the church and in no other way. And so this was the battle he was fighting. Eventually it became such a heated one that he had to escape. In 1525, he would leave England, never to return again. But where does he go? He has to go somewhere where it is easier for him to get underground and hide and complete his full translation of the Bible. The New Testament is already done. The Old Testament is already almost completed. It was slowed by those who were chasing after him that very year when he escaped. He had been housed in a printing house with the Gutenberg press, and the owner of that printing house found out in just enough time to let him know that they were coming. And they were coming to take him and ultimately burn him at the stake. He had just enough time to gather up all of his manuscripts, all of his notes, and to escape with the majority of the Old Testament done in 1525. Now, from that point forward, he's got to find a place to go. Where does he go? And this is where we owe credit to Martin Luther and the efforts that he has made. I said last week we wouldn't go into a great detail of Luther because he doesn't have much direct correlation with the English Bible in and of itself. However, in this moment, he does. Because the place where Tyndale lands is one that would be very familiar to any student of this kind of history. He lands in Worms, Germany. The place where Luther himself was tried as a heretic, where he stood before cardinals and bishops and higher ranking officials of the Catholic Church and said, "Here I stand upon what he was teaching in the differences of salvation between what the Catholic Church taught and what he was teaching. Again, Luther went too far. He was teaching salvation by grace alone, through faith alone. But the thing that it brought about was the German translation of the Scriptures. And as the German people gained a copy of the Scriptures in their language, it led to something from 1523 forward that we know of as the Peasants' Revolt. For a moment, you're starting to see cracks. Cracks in the armor of the Catholic Church because the people turned against them. And as the Peasant Revolt was going on, based upon their knowledge of what Luther was teaching and what they had gained through his translation of the Scriptures, they began to turn against the Catholic Church, and therefore they would hide people like Tyndale when he came. He needed to find a place where there was a great deal of trees. Why? Because what is the main part of paper? Trees. He needed to find a place with good running water. Worms is beautiful, and there's quite a good deal of good running water there to make the paper process happen. And so he began printing copies of his completed Bible while there in Worms, Germany. And they began spreading throughout Europe like wildfire. Had it not been for the very place where Luther would be tried and later die for his efforts, perhaps we would not have the copies of the Scripture which we have in our hands now. Now eventually, Tyndale is found, he is betrayed, he is turned upon, and he must escape again. So then he escapes to Brussels. And while in Brussels, he is continuing to do all that he can to provide a copy of the Scriptures for the common people. He eventually makes a second edition of his translation, and it is from that second edition, again, as I've said, the majority of your King James text comes from. So we have a lot to thank for that second edition. But while there in Brussels, he is again betrayed by a very close friend, and he will eventually be burned at the stake. As he is awaiting his inevitable death there, he will cry out, "Lord, open the king's eyes." Now, I've always wondered if that was a moment such as Cornelius, seeking to find the truth. I cannot say whether or not it actually was, but because of his efforts, eventually, about 100 years later, well, really less than that at this point, the king's eyes would be opened. The king's authorized translation, also known to us as the King James translation, would be translated. It would be published. And every modern version which has been produced since has that version to thank. Though they may come from different text base, which we're going to talk about in a later lesson after we've spent a good deal of time on the development of the King James Bible next week. Had it not been for the work of Tyndale and the subsequent production of that authorized translation, you and I would not have the freedom to see the Bible presented in the English language as we do today. The 500,000 people that we talked about last week, and more that were downloading these apps and such, and how they've grown, where the English Bible in every shape, size, and form is presented so easily on every cell phone, would not be available to us had it not been for these efforts. They were not Christians, but they were dedicated. This man spent 12 years away from his home country on the run, all to give you and I the chance to have our Bibles. And that's something to be admired. and something to be remembered. And it's why I thought this would be an important study for us. So that is Tyndale and his translation. Next week, we will pick up with the ultimate fruition of his words there when the king's eyes are opened in 1611. I'll have an example of that copy of the scriptures for anyone who wants to see it, and we will talk about the amazing story behind how it came about as well next week. Later after that, towards the last section of the class now, as we're getting into the later weeks, we will spend more time on the idea of translation theory and the modern versions and how those developed post the King James as well. All right, well, thank you for your attention this morning, and I hope this has been beneficial to you, because I know it has been for me.